In this lesson, we will explore the link between the challenge to poverty and the contemporary phenomena of planetary urban growth, showing the need to consider the close relationship between SDG 1 and SDG 11 to implement Agenda 2030. The explosive growth in recent decades of new cities and megalopolis, particularly in emerging and developing countries, has actually occurred and still occurs through the expansion of huge informal and substandard settlements, named according to the country's favelas, slum, shanty towns, bidonvilles and many other ways, where more than 800 million poor people live in very precarious conditions, so that urban growth, in many cases, seems to be an expansion of poverty rather than a driver for development and social improvement. Why urban growth can increase poverty? There is a fateful date, the year 2007, in which for the first time in history the urban population exceeded the rural one. This happened thanks to the rapid urbanization that occurred in some contexts, located mainly in developing countries of the Global South. It is mostly the migration from the rural areas to cities of poor people in search of better living conditions and job opportunities, together with the high birth rate, that feed the dizzying urban growth in less developed countries. According to the last World Urbanization Prospects of the United Nations, in 2050, about 70% of the world population will be urbanized, and much of it will be located in developing regions. The result will be that 95% of urban sprawl in the coming decades will take place in these regions, and the informal areas of the poor, which in many cases already make up 70% or even 80% of new urbanization, despite a certain slowdown in some contexts, will continue to grow. Where are and what are informal settlements? Currently, it is estimated that 250 million people is living in informal settlement in East Asia, compared with 200 million in sub-Saharan Africa and 100 million in Latin America. But while in Asia it is one-third of the urban population to live in slums on the edge of megacities, in Africa it is two-thirds. Of course, in so different contexts, informal settlements are not only variously named, but also differently characterized, but they share some fundamental traits. Firstly, they are unplanned areas with substandard housing, self-built by the inhabitants with poor materials, without guarantees of land rights. Secondly, they are settlements with very limited access to basic services, drinking water, sanitation, energy, food, and other public facilities such as healthcare, schools, transport, etc. Thirdly, they are settlements often located near landfills and industrial plants in geological risk or contaminated areas. Above all, the informal settlements share an underlying rationality. They are the self-produced response to the housing need of the poor of the new megacities who do not find other opportunities such as public rental housing. But what are the risks and negative impacts of such urbanization? The first negative impact is the growth of areas of exclusion that risk becoming permanent, large parts of unequal and unhealthy cities from which only a minority of inhabitants are able to emancipate themselves. Secondly, the use without rules of the soil and the lack of the necessary infrastructure give rise to an extremely vulnerable built environment, subject to many risks. floods, fires, pollution, environmental degradation. Informal settlements are therefore one of the most important challenges for the sustainability of planetary urban growth. A sustainability not only environmental, but also and above all social, which means the ability to imagine future developments that face this gigantic condition of social and spatial inequality. What has been done to reduce urban poverty? As highlighted by some recent studies on SLUM policies in the 21st century, many decades have passed since the themes of informal settlements and urban poverty have gained importance in the agenda not only of many national governments, but also those of the main international organizations involved in cooperation and development, such as the World Bank and the United Nations Programme for Human Settlements, UN-Habitat. Many reports have been published and many interventions have been put in place by this international organization to address the phenomena. To name just a few, in 2000 it was launched by City Alliance, a multilateral organization founded by UN-Habitat and World Bank, the Cities Without Slums Action Plan, and in 2003 the Global Report on Human Settlements was dedicated to the challenge of slums. And again in the last conference, Habitat III, held in Quito in 2016, one of the main themes was housing and sustainable urban development, an updating of the housing problem at planetary scale that has not yet found adequate answers. What has been achieved? The interventions promoted directly by this organization or by governments, local authorities and NGOs that have followed their strategies have allowed to experiment with actual alternatives to the brutal slum clearance interventions, demolition and removal of inhabitants, often practiced at the beginning of the phenomenon, but still today practiced in many contexts. They range from assistance to self-construction of housing, a strategy called site and services, to the most recent strategy for rehabilitating poor neighborhoods, named slum upgrading. The upgrading has been widely disseminated and articulated, providing in many cases not only basic services, but also other improvements such as measures to support the possession of housing and land, titling, access to credit for the redevelopment of houses, support for the creation of community-based services and for the start-up of economic activities, etc. Millions of people have benefited from this intervention, improving their housing and living conditions, and upgrading is still the main housing policy for urban poor in many countries. However, there are criticisms of interventions that have sometimes proved ephemeral or ineffective. Moreover, the dimensions of the phenomenon of urban informality and its continuous diffusion greatly reduce the results obtained with those policies. In conclusion, the problem of informal urbanization continues to be a great challenge for social and environmental sustainability of fast-growing cities of Global South, and the positive opportunities to be seized and exploited, the strategies and tools to be activated are still largely to be found. A commitment for sustainable urban development and fight against urban poverty that calls to action between many others, universities, young scholars and professionals, especially those involved in city design and management.